financial system has officially changed forever as the BRICS countries came out in 2022 announcing that they are done using the US dollar and they're going to create a new global reserve currency. These nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are fed up with the US dollar's exorbitant privilege, and their challenge to the dollar's hegemony should not be underestimated, especially considering they control more than 40% of the global landmass, they house more than 40% of the global population, and more importantly than any of that, they have overtaken the G7 in terms of their GDP, meaning that they are economically superior to the G7 nations in the West. But if you thought that was bad for the United States, it just got even worse, because recently, over 25 different countries have all applied to become a part of this BRICS coalition because they too are sick of the US dollar's hegemony, okay? Of course, we're talking about countries all around the world such as Albania, Argentina, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Nicaragua, Turkey, Afghanistan, Egypt, Kazakhstan. I'll stop there. I think you guys get the idea. But countries all around the world are rejecting the US dollar-led status quo that we have been operating under over the past 100 years. So we can see here for the past 50 years, the US dollar has been used for more than 80 to 85% of all global trade. And the reason 90% of the world's global trade was done in dollars was because the dollar is the global reserve currency, okay? Oil was priced in dollars all around the world, and oil is the lifeblood of the global economy. And not only that, but there's all sorts of US dollar denominated debt scattered all over the world. When people thought that the US dollar would lose its global reserve currency in the 1970s due to that enormous bout of inflation, countries around the world loaded up on US dollar debt because they're betting, hey, the US dollar is about to hyperinflate. I'm going to load up on this debt. And that trend has only continued over the past 50 years. The dollar is king, and it's not just in transactions that it's being used. The dollar is also being held in the reserves of lots of different central banks and governments all around the world. But all of that began to change in the 21st century as central banks all around the world began dumping their US dollars from their reserves. We can see on this chart here, since 2003, dollars held in reserves has dropped by around 72%, all the way down to 57% today, and things are getting worse because guess what central banks are dumping their dollars for? Gold. To understand who, and more importantly, why countries around the world are de-dollarizing their foreign exchange reserves, we need to have a look at the brief history of the BRICS countries, okay? They were created in 2009, 1 year after the global financial crisis. The reason for this was the world was annoyed at the US dollar and in particular, the Federal Reserve printing $700 billion out of thin air to bail out their banks, okay? The world was saving in dollars. It was in the reserves of countries all around the world. And all of a sudden, their reserves and their savings were devalued literally overnight as the US printed $700 billion to save its own banking system. And originally, the BRICS was just BRIC. There was no South Africa until 2010. So the year after the BRICS formed, South Africa joined the ranks. But then for 10 years, nothing happened in terms of the BRICS. No other countries really wanted to join the BRICS coalition until 2022. That was the year that everything changed. Not only are these countries applying to become a part of the BRICS, but they're already actively changing their treasury reserve strategy as we speak right now today. We can see this chart. This shows the volume of gold that central banks have been buying over the past 60 years. We can see between 1975 and 2009, central banks were selling gold. They didn't care. They didn't need gold. That was because the world was operating on this petrodollar backed system. The world saved in US dollars. That was because oil was denominated in US dollars, and lots of countries around the world actually have US dollar denominated debt. So we can see they didn't care about gold, okay? They thought that the gold standard was well and truly over. But all that changed in 2009. We can see that over the past 10 years, central banks have bought more gold in those 10 years than the past 60 years combined, okay? That's enormous. And 2022 actually marked an all-time high for the central bank's buying of gold. When we look at the holdings of what is actually inside the reserves of lots of these central banks around the world, we can see a very interesting trend, okay? Venezuela currently has 82% of its reserves in gold. Uzbekistan has 65% of its reserves in gold. Kazakhstan, 63%. Bolivia, 55%. Belarus, 40%. Turkey, 29%. And interestingly, Turkey was the largest importer of gold in 2022. That would be obviously because the Turkish lira is absolutely hyperinflating as we speak, with inflation above 100%. So these are some massive changes that's happening in the reserves of countries all around the world. But why? What are the signposts we should be looking at? I actually think there's three really large major nails that have been hammered into the coffin of the petrodollar system right now, today in April 2023. So we're talking about the Saudis, and we're talking about China, and of course we're going to be talking about the biggest betrayal that I think we have seen from Western allies. We're going to be talking about Japan and Mexico. So first, let's start off with China. Everybody's talking about the fact that, Ray Dalio is correct. China is the next global rising superpower, and they're about to overtake the United States. So everybody's trying to do trade deals with China. They're dumping the US dollar, and they're trying to move towards these Chinese yuan settled deals. Now, I'm going to do a whole video in the not too distant future breaking down why I disagree with this narrative about China being this really strong global superpower, and that is because they have terrible demographics. They have terrible energy reliability. They're suffering a water crisis, not to mention the fact that they have one of the most bankrupt economic systems in the world, as well as the fact that they're being led by communism. We all know from the 20th century that communism always fails, but we're going to leave that for another video. What we're going to focus on today is the trade deals that China's doing with countries all around the world. So China's been expanding their Belt and Road Initiative over the past decade. They have their hands in all sorts of countries in Latin America and Africa. They're even setting up energy deals with other countries such as Russia and settling those energy deals in alternative currencies away from the US dollar. Of course, China stopped buying US dollars and treasuries for their central bank's reserves in around 2016. They are one of the largest holders of US treasuries in the world alongside Japan. And we can see for the past 6 years, they didn't really buy any more treasuries. And over the past 12 months, they've been actively dumping those treasuries after they saw what happened to US treasuries when their good friends, Russia, had their reserves frozen. So China has bilateral trade agreements with 41 different countries all around the world, and they're trying desperately to get countries to accept Chinese yuan, okay? We can see that Chinese yuan in the reserves of central banks and governments around the world has slowly increased over the past few years, but not as much as most people think when we talk about, China's dominance. A lot of people make China out to be this big dominant superpower, and really, the amount of Chinese yuan that's in the reserves of central banks around the world, it's a pretty minuscule figure in reality. But China's been making some moves recently to really unsettle this petrodollar system agreement. Just last week, they partnered up with the Saudis to actually denominate oil trade in yuan. And this is very big. This is very interesting. And this is a growing trend of China trying to spread the yuan to countries all around the world. China is actually the world's biggest energy importer, which is really bad for China, but they've managed to actually settle oil and energy trades with Russia in Chinese yuan and Russian rubles. So this is big. They're making shifts, and we can see that Chinese yuan in the treasuries of central banks around the world is slowly increasing, okay? People are beginning to put some of their reserves in yuan, but it's still a minuscule figure when we compare that to the dominance of the US dollar, okay? And it's interesting, okay, that I bring up that recent oil trade deal with Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is the second big nail in the coffin of the petrodollar system that I want to discuss today. And that is because the petrodollar system was built upon the foundation of these OPEC nations, mainly being Saudi Arabia, denominating and selling their precious oil in US dollars. Now, today, I actually just want to focus on the recent developments and the moves from the BRICS nations, as well as the more recent things that are putting massive holes in the petrodollar system. But I will be doing a video on the petrodollar system in the not too distant future, breaking down how they found themselves to be at the very core of today's financial system. If you want to see that video, let me know in the comments down below. And if you're enjoying this one, feel free to slap a like on it and subscribe to the channel. Doing those two things really does help our channel out, and we appreciate all of the love. So moving on, the Saudis have just waged economic war on the United States and the West only this week, okay? They came out and they said, guess what? We're actually going to cut oil production by 1 million barrels per day. So naturally, this is going to be very inflationary for the West, okay? If you cut supply of oil, there's less supply and the same amount of demand prices have to rise. And that's why oil jumped 10% earlier this week. And remember, in 2022, when the Saudis first announced that they were going to begin to cut oil production, only days Joe Biden was literally begging the Saudis to actually turn the spigots back on and pump more oil because he was trying to bring down CPI inflation in 2022. But the Saudis said, sorry, guys, we're not going to do it. And that is because the United States actually left Afghanistan in 2021, leaving the Saudis absolutely naked, okay? They said, sorry, we're not going to give you any more military protection. And literally days later, the Saudis made a military agreement with Russia to actually ensure that Russia would protect the Saudis. Now, we're going to do a whole nother video on why I believe Credit Suisse could have been a controlled demolition in the battle between the Saudis and the West, okay? We're going to do that for another video, but let's move on to the final nail that I believe has been smashed into the coffin of the petrodollar system recently, okay? Obviously, Japan. Japan has recently betrayed the United States, who is supposed to be their closest allies in the West, by ignoring the sanctions and the price caps on Russian gas. Japan has recently just entered into a trade deal with Russia, and of course, the US was okay. They said, look, we can't do anything about it. We're going to give Japan an exemption, okay? Now, this should highlight the fact that the United States really doesn't have any real physical power. It's only abstract power, okay? It's political power. It's not real power. They can't physically stop somebody from trading with Russia, one of the largest energy producers in the world, okay? And something else that's really interesting with this Japan point is the fact that Mexico came out this week and has officially applied to become a part of the BRICS. So I believe this is the third nail in the coffin for the petrodollar's death. This is betrayal, okay? The United States is being betrayed by some of its biggest partners, Japan and Mexico. Mexico is important because its labor is actually 3 times more efficient than Chinese labor, and it's half the price, okay? Peter Zeihan brought up this point in a Joe Rogan interview, and it's a very good one. If the world is kind of fracturing apart and the United States and China is bifurcating apart, well, the United States needs somebody to actually manufacture all of the goods and services for them for a cheap price. Until recently, I actually thought this would be Mexico, but now Mexico looks as if it's going the way that all of the other Latin American countries are going, and that is away from the United States and towards China. This chart here shows that China is now doing more trade with all of these countries in South and Central America than America is doing, okay? Think about that. China's on the other side of the world and is doing more trade with all of the United States' closest geographical partners. That's a worrying trend, and I believe this could potentially isolate the United States in the future. I did a video breaking all of this down in a little bit more detail, showing how China is infiltrating the world with its Belt and Road Initiative. I think that video was done in 2022, so check that out if you are interested. But these are the 3 big nails in the coffin of the petrodollar system. There's also lots of smaller announcements that have been happening in the past couple of weeks alone, okay? So the Malaysian minister came out this week and they said that they want to implement an Asian monetary fund to get away from the dollar. This comes days after many finance ministers in Southeast Asia also came out saying, hey, guess what? We need to remove our reliance on Visa and MasterCard because we don't want to be sanctioned like Russia was in 2022. These countries include the Philippines, Singapore, Myanmar, Malaysia, Indonesia, Cambodia, and a couple of other countries are all a part of this ASEAN coalition. And then this video also surfaced this week on Twitter. It is the president of Kenya saying some very interesting things.
For the people who work numbers, I am giving you free advice that those of you who are holding dollars, you surely might go into losses. You better do what you must do, because this market is going to be different in a couple of weeks.
So what are your thoughts on that one? I thought it was a little bit interesting. Almost sounds as if he knows something that we don't know. I think it's worth noting that the currency in Kenya is also getting decimated right now against the US dollar. So maybe that's what that speech was about. Maybe he was just trying to incentivize more people to stop racing out of its local currency. But before we get into the takeaways and the conclusions and showing you what ramifications and implications I think this BRICS de-dollarization is going to have on the world and the US global reserve currency, I just wanted to quickly let you guys know that you're probably going to love the newsletter / article that I wrote on this topic earlier in the week. That puppy is linked down below, and it's far more detailed than what I have gone through in today's video. There's only so many charts and statistics and receipts that I can bring and cram inside one 15-minute video. So consider subscribing to that newsletter, because I'm writing on all sorts of different topics on a more regular basis. But let's get into this. Is de-dollarization happening? Yes, it is. The world is de-dollarizing, but the world is more divided than it ever has been before. We've had 80 years of globalization since World War II in the 1940s. We've had this era of global peace and cooperation. This has helped countries like China, who I don't think will actually be as strong as many people think they will be in this new world that we're moving into of deglobalization. And the world right now is divided between the countries, such as these BRICS countries, who produce real goods and services and have a monopoly on the commodities around the world. They are simply sick of receiving paper promises for these goods and services and commodities. They're sick of it and they want out. But this doesn't change the fact that the US dollar is still king. Even if we have a look at the total fiat currency reserves around the world, yes, the dollar's declined from around 70% to 59%, but the other currencies haven't really gained much ground on the dollar. The euro's been flat for the past 15 years, and yes, you might see a little bit of an uptick in the Chinese yuan and the other on that chart, but it is pretty minuscule really in comparison to the big picture, okay? Yes, the Chinese yuan has actually overtaken the US dollar when we look at the reserves held in Russia, but that's the only country that the yuan is beating the US dollar at, okay? And, you know, yes, we are starting to see more de-dollarization and dumping of US dollars in reserves of countries all around the world, but has it affected the strength of the US dollar? No. The Dixie Index that measures the strength of the United States dollar compared to other fiat currencies around the world was actually at 79 in 2014. That was the year that I believe this de-dollarization trend actually began, okay? That was the year Russia invaded Crimea and they began dumping US dollars. China stopped buying US treasuries in 2016. And most people think, oh, you know, we've been in this massive decline of the US dollar since 2015, 2016. Wrong. The dollar's gotten stronger despite this de-dollarizing that is happening in the reserves of countries and central banks all around the world. So eventually, yes, the United States will need to find a buyer for that $33 trillion of debt that it has, as well as the $200 trillion of unfunded liabilities, okay? It is going to need to find a buyer of that, but it is not going to mean imminent hyperinflation for the United States dollar if we continue to see de-dollarization in the next couple of years from these BRICS countries and the other 20 or so countries that have expressed interest in becoming a part of the BRICS coalition, okay? It is going to take a lot of weight and a lot of countries to actually disrupt and unroot the dollar from its global reserve currency status, okay? In 1944, 44 countries got together and agreed that we would begin using the US dollar as the global reserve currency. And today we are starting to reach a critical mass of countries coming out against that system, saying, look, I've had enough of using this US dollar. I want to do something new. And something I almost forgot to mention in today's video is talking about the timeline of this potential fiat currency endgame. A lot of people are saying, look, you know, we're still 20, 30, 50 years away from a new reserve currency taking the world by storm. And these people are discounting the amount of change that I believe we're going to see in the next 5 years. I think 2020 was actually a little bit of a monetary chasm or a Rubicon, so to say. And since then, we're living in this age of acceleration. So just think about it for a second. In 2020, we saw the fastest 35% crash in the equity market in history, okay? Faster than the 1929 stock market crash, okay? And then in 2021, we saw the highest inflation that we've seen in over 50 years. In 2022, we saw the fastest interest rate hiking schedule from central bankers in history. And today in 2023, we just witnessed one of the fastest bank runs that we've seen in the past 80 years of US history. And we're watching Credit Suisse and Deutsche Bank currently on the brink of collapse, and they are multi-trillion-dollar banks. So I think things are escalating and happening quicker and quicker than they have done over the past 50 years, okay? I look at the era of 1975 to 2020 as this kind of gradually phase in monetary history, and I think 2021 in particular could mark the suddenly phase in monetary change, okay? Most people would be familiar with the phrase gradually, then suddenly. I think we're living through the suddenly phase. I think 2020 is the monetary inflection point, and I think people are going to race to accumulate money outside of the system and outside of fiat control. We're moving into this world where nobody trusts each other anymore, okay? The world is deglobalizing. Global trust and cooperation is done. It's broken. It ended in 2022. And I think currencies that sit outside the system are going to benefit very well. Obviously, gold, as we're speaking right now, is breaking out to all-time highs in currencies all around the world. And that is because these central bankers are accumulating gold hand over fist. And obviously, Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin is the perfect solution for a deglobalized world in the digital age, okay? Gold just simply does not scale in the digital age. How do I send gold to somebody in Venezuela, Cuba, Africa, or Australia if the governments are becoming more and more tyrannical? They're simply going to seize my gold at the borders, okay? And just recently, Perth Mint got busted for selling billions of dollars of gold to China that was fake. It wasn't real. You can't verify whether you have real gold or not unless you have $1,000 machine to actually test the gold. Look, nothing against gold. I was a gold bug when I was 19. I was that weird kid who was buying gold when he was 19 before I even bought any Bitcoin. But in the digital age, there is only one solution for a trustless world, and I believe that is Bitcoin. Okay, I can verify on my own computer in literally seconds that I'm holding real Bitcoin, and I don't need to have any money, any fancy software, any fancy machine to test that the gold is real for me to actually know that I have real Bitcoin, and I can then send that real Bitcoin to anyone, anywhere around the world, whether they're in Canada, America, Africa, Latin America, or Australia, or even Asia. I can send them Bitcoin instantly, trustlessly, and without any counterparty risk, peer to peer. But you guys let me know in the comments down below what you thought of this video. What is the best solution to a de-dollarizing world? Is the United States going to be the last global reserve currency? And who is going to be the sugar daddy for the United States government? I have a little bit of a left field theory on who I think will be the next United States sugar daddy, and that will actually come in the form of US dollar stable coins, who today are nearly 100% backed by US government debt. Yes, I'm talking about the traditionally known as risky and unbacked Tether, as well as the USDC stablecoin. That is $150 billion of firepower. That is over 80% backed by US dollars and US government debt. But we can get into the Bitcoin milkshake theory in another video. If you enjoyed this one, feel free to slap a like on it and subscribe to the channel. If you do want some money outside the system that is going to perform perfectly in the digital age, you can get $10 of free Bitcoin from my amazing show sponsors who help to improve the quality of the videos over here on YouTube. You can check out Swan Bitcoin in the comments and the description down below. And you can also get 10% off a Bitcoin hardware wallet from the Foundation Passport, guys. Okay, there's no point owning Bitcoin if you own it on an exchange. Not your keys, not your coins. Russia learned that in 2022. The same applies for Bitcoin. Put it into your own self-custody. If you need help putting your own Bitcoin into your own self-custody, you can hit us up at Coinbase Connect. We are a Bitcoin-only educational company, and we specialize in helping people who are having any sort of Bitcoin technical difficulties. So with all that said, guys, if you enjoyed this video, I'm going to slap another couple up on screen that I think you will enjoy. With all that said, I'll see you all in the next video.